Way up above the world, right where the sky seemed to touch the edge of the sea, there stood the golden palace of Helios, the Titan who carried the sun across the heavens every single day. Hardly any mortal ever worked up the courage to approach that place. But one boy, driven half mad by doubt and by longing, was about to make a journey that would change everything for him. His name was Phaethon, and he was the son of Helios and a nymph named Clymene. He'd grown up far from his father's blazing halls, out in the quiet river valleys of Ethiopia. Even though he'd never once laid eyes on the god who fathered him, Phaethon wore that name like a badge of honor, bragging to anyone who'd listened that divine blood ran in his veins. Then one day a friend mocked him for it, laughing that no mortal boy could really claim the sun god as his father, and that his pride was nothing more than a story his mother told him to make him feel better about himself. That insult cut deep, so Phaethon set out for the ends of the earth, following the path of the rising sun all the way until he reached the golden gates of his father's palace. Light poured off every wall, blinding and brilliant, forged by Hephaestus himself, and there, sitting on a throne surrounded by the shifting shapes of the hours, the days, the months, and the seasons, was Helios himself, radiant and almost too much to look at. Helios was overjoyed to finally see his son. He took off his crown of light so Phaethon could look at him without being scorched, and he swore on the river Styx, an oath not even a god can break, that he'd grant the boy anything he wanted. It was exactly the proof Phaethon had been chasing, and without a second thought, he made his request. Let him drive his father's chariot across the sky, just for one day. Helios's heart sank the moment he heard it. He knew that request was a death sentence wrapped up as an honor. Those 4 horses that pulled the chariot breathed fire, and they were wild and powerful beyond anything a mortal could hope to control. The road across the heavens was narrow and treacherous, threading between monstrous constellations and blazing so close to the earth that even the gods could barely stand the heat of it. He begged his son to ask for something else instead, offering him riches, kingdoms, anything at all. But the oath was already sworn, and Phaethon, too proud to back down, wouldn't budge. So, as dawn crept closer, Helios reluctantly smoothed a protective ointment over his son's face to shield him from the flames, then watched, helpless, as Phaethon climbed up onto the great chariot. The instant the reins landed in mortal hands, the horses felt the change and bolted, no longer answering to a god's will. Phaethon was thrown around the sky, the chariot swinging wildly through the heavens, at times flying too high and freezing the world below into sudden winter, at other times dropping too low and scorching forests, drying up rivers, and turning green plains into desert. People say the skin of those living beneath the chariot's path was darkened forever by that day's heat, and that the burning is why the sands of Africa have stayed barren ever since. Gaia, mother of the earth, cried out to Zeus in agony, begging him to put an end to the destruction before it consumed all of creation. With no other option left, Zeus hurled a thunderbolt at the runaway chariot and struck Phaethon light out of his seat. The boy fell burning through the sky like a shooting star, landing at last in the waters of the river Eridanus, far from everything he'd ever known. His sisters, the Haliades, wept for him without end, until the gods, moved by their endless grief, turned them into poplar trees along the riverbank, their tears becoming amber as they dropped into the water. Helios, mourning his son, refused to drive his chariot for days on end, plunging the world into darkness, until the other gods finally convinced him the world simply couldn't survive without his light. So he went back to his duties, though people say his sorrow never really left him, a quiet reminder that even the children of gods aren't spared the weight of their own ambition. Far from the scorched plains that Phaethon's fall had once touched, out in the wooded hills of Arcadia, there lived a huntress named Callisto. She was one of Artemis's most devoted companions, swift and fierce, and, like all of the goddess's attendants, she'd sworn an oath of eternal chastity, choosing the freedom of the wild over any man's company. But her beauty hadn't escaped Zeus's notice. Watching her from Olympus, he found himself consumed with desire for her. Knowing she'd never willingly break her sacred vow, he came up with a deception, disguising himself as Artemis so he could approach her without raising any suspicion. Trusting the figure in front of her was truly her beloved goddess, Callisto let her guard down, and by the time she realized the trick that had been played on her, it was already too late. Months passed, and Callisto's secret started to show. When Artemis and her attendants stopped to bathe in a cool forest spring, there was no hiding it any longer. And the goddess, furious that her oath had been broken, cast Callisto out from her company without any mercy, refusing to even hear her out. Alone now and grieving, Callisto gave birth to a son she named Arcas. But her suffering was far from finished, because Hera, who'd long suspected her husband of straying, learned the truth of what had happened in those Arcadian woods. Eaten up with jealousy, she descended on Callisto, and grabbing a fistful of her hair, transformed her into a great bear, cursing her to wander the forest in a form that was no longer her own, feared now by the very hunters who'd once called her a friend. For years, Callisto roamed the wilderness as a bear, her human mind trapped inside a beast's body, terrified of the hunters and wolves stalking the same woods she'd once known so well. Meanwhile, her son Arcas grew into manhood, never knowing what had become of her mother, raised by others in her absence, and he became a skilled hunter in his own right. One day, out hunting in the forests of Arcadia, Arcas came across a great bear that, strangely, walked right up to him without any fear at all, its eyes full of a longing he couldn't understand. It was Callisto, recognizing her son after all those years apart, desperate to embrace him despite the monstrous shape she was trapped in. But all Arcas saw was a wild animal closing in on him, so he raised his spear to strike the killing blow, a blow that would have ended his own mother's life without either of them ever knowing the truth of it. It was right at that final moment that Zeus, watching from above and moved by pity for the suffering he himself had caused, stepped in. He swept both mother and son up into the heavens and turned them into constellations, fixed among the stars forever, with Callisto becoming Ursa Major, the great bear, and Arcas becoming Ursa Minor, the little bear, bound together for eternity in the night sky, never to be separated again. But Hera's fury wasn't finished yet. Enraged that her rival had been rewarded with a place among the stars instead of being punished further, she went to the sea god Oceanus and his wife Tethys and begged them to forbid the two bears from ever dipping below the horizon to rest, the way every other constellation did. And that, the story goes, is why Ursa Major and Ursa Minor still circle endlessly around the pole star to this day, never sinking below the horizon, forever denied the rest given to every other star, a lasting reminder of one jealous queen's fury and of the long shadow cast by Zeus's desires. On the slopes of Mount Latmus, where the air stayed cool and the silence went unbroken, there lived a shepherd of extraordinary beauty named Endymion. Some said he'd once been a king who walked away from his throne to live among the flocks, while others insisted he was born a simple shepherd, but everyone agreed that no mortal man before him had ever been quite so fair to look at. It was there, tending his sheep under the open sky, that he first caught the eye of Selene, goddess of the moon, as she made her nightly crossing of the heavens. Night after night she'd pause her great silver chariot just to gaze down at him while he slept among the rocks, her light falling soft across his face. And little by little the goddess found herself falling deeply in love with a mortal shepherd who didn't even know she was watching him. But Selene's love came with a terrible sorrow attached, because she knew that Endymion, like every mortal, was bound to grow old and die one day, while she herself would go on forever, unchanging. Unable to stand the thought of losing him to age, she went to Zeus and pleaded for a single gift on her beloved's behalf: eternal youth. Zeus agreed, but only on one condition: that Endymion would be cast into an unending sleep, preserved forever in the beauty of his youth, never to wake, never to grow old, but never again to walk or speak or feel the days pass by. Some say it was Endymion himself who chose this fate, having been offered anything he wanted by Zeus, and asking only for eternal sleep, so that death could never lay a hand on him. Whatever the reason behind it, Selene accepted the bargain, unwilling to lose him completely, even if it meant she'd never hear his voice again. And so each night, once her duties across the sky were done, Selene would descend to the cave on Mount Latmus where Endymion lay sleeping, his beauty untouched by time, and she'd lie beside him until dawn forced her back to the heavens. It's said that during these visits she bore him 50 daughters, though how children could come from a love shared only in sleep remained one of the many mysteries the Greeks never quite explained. Shepherds who wandered the slopes of Latmus in the years that followed would sometimes talk about catching a glimpse of the sleeping man, still young, still beautiful, undisturbed by wind or rain, and about a pale light that seemed to linger over the cave each night, long after the moon had set everywhere else in the sky. To the Greeks, Endymion's story became a kind of meditation on the price of immortality, a reminder that escaping death entirely isn't always the mercy it looks like, and that even a goddess's love couldn't undo the quiet stillness of an endless sleep. Far to the east, in the kingdom of Cyprus, a story of beauty and tragedy was about to unfold, one that would touch even Aphrodite, goddess of love herself. It started with Mira, a Cypriot princess whose mother had once boasted that her daughter's beauty outshone even Aphrodite's own. Furious at the insult, the goddess cursed Myrrha with an unnatural, forbidden desire for her own father, King Cinyras, a curse so shameful that Myrrha fought against it for months, even trying to take her own life rather than give in to such a terrible longing. But her old nurse discovered her mistress's torment, and, fearing for her life, arranged for Myrrha to slip into her father's bedchamber under cover of darkness during a festival, at a time when Cinyras had drunk too much wine to recognize his own daughter. This went on for 12 nights, until the king, curious about who his secret lover was, finally brought a lamp into the room and discovered the truth in horror. Enraged and grief-stricken, Cinyras drew his sword to kill her, but Myrrha fled into the wilderness, running until her legs simply couldn't carry her any further. There, exhausted and pregnant with a child that was both her own and her father's, she cried out to the gods to spare her from both the living and the dead, unable to bear the shame of either fate. Taking pity on her, the gods turned her into a myrrh tree, and her tears became the fragrant resin that carries her name to this day. Months later, the trunk of that tree split open, and out of it came a child of extraordinary beauty, a boy named Adonis. Aphrodite herself, moved by the strange circumstances of his birth, took the infant and hid him away in a chest, entrusting his care to Persephone, queen of the underworld, believing her realm would keep him safe until he was grown. But Persephone, raising the boy in the shadowed halls below, grew every bit as enchanted by his beauty as Aphrodite had been, and when the time came to give him back, she refused, unwilling to part with him. The argument between the two goddesses grew so heated that it ended up in front of Zeus himself, who, trying to find something fair, decreed that Adonis would spend a third of each year with Persephone in the underworld, a third with Aphrodite up on earth, and the final third wherever he chose to go himself. Adonis, utterly devoted to Aphrodite, always chose to spend that free portion with her too, leaving Persephone with just a third of his company each year. For a while, Aphrodite and Adonis lived happily together, with the goddess setting aside her usual pursuits to hunt beside him through forests and fields, always careful to warn him against chasing the most dangerous of beasts, since even though he was loved by a goddess, he remained mortal and vulnerable to the world's cruelty. But Adonis, proud of his skill and hungry for glory, wouldn't heed her warnings forever. One day, while Aphrodite was away, he went after a wild boar he'd wounded with his spear, chasing it deep into the underbrush. The beast, some say sent by a jealous Ares, furious at losing Aphrodite's affection to a mortal, turned on Adonis and gored him through the thigh, leaving him bleeding among the roots and thorns. Aphrodite, hearing his cries from far across the sky, rushed to him, her bare feet tearing on the brambles as she ran, and it said the drops of her blood stained the white roses of the field red for the very first time. But by the time she got to him, it was already too late, and Adonis died in her arms, his beauty fading even as she wept over him.
Refusing to let death claim him entirely, Aphrodite caused a flower to bloom from his spilled blood. The crimson anemone, delicate and short-lived, scattered by the slightest breeze, just like Adonis's own life had been. In her grief, she pleaded with Zeus to let Adonis return to her for part of each year, the same way he'd once divided his time between the goddess of love and the queen of the dead. Zeus granted her wish, and so Adonis, just like Persephone before him, became tied to the turning of the seasons, spending half the year below the earth in death and half above it in life, his return each spring marked by flowers blooming across the Greek world, a brief, beautiful reminder that not even beauty can outrun mortality. In the rolling hills of Phrygia, where countless little villages dotted the landscape, there lived an elderly couple named Baucis and Philemon, poor in wealth but rich in devotion, having spent their whole lives together in a small cottage of straw and reed at the edge of their village. They had little to their name, but they were content. Content with each other, and content in the simple rhythms of a long and honest life.
One evening, as the sun began to set, two weary travelers made their way through the village, knocking on door after door, looking for shelter for the night. But the villagers, suspicious of strangers and unwilling to share what little they had, turned them away one by one, slamming their doors without a second thought. What none of them realized was that these travelers were no ordinary men at all. They were Zeus and Hermes, disguised as mortals to test the hospitality of the people below, since hospitality, the sacred duty owed to any guest or stranger, was considered one of the most solemn obligations a mortal could uphold. Exhausted and turned away from nearly every household, the two gods finally arrived at the small, humble cottage of Baucis and Philemon, right at the edge of the village. Even though their home was barely big enough for the two of them, the elderly couple welcomed the strangers without a moment's hesitation, ushering them inside and getting to work preparing whatever meal they could offer. Philemon stoked the fire, while Baucis gathered vegetables from their modest garden, apologizing the whole time that they had no grander feast to share. As the meal went on, Baucis and Philemon noticed something strange. No matter how much wine she poured from their little jug, it never seemed to run dry, refilling itself again and again, no matter how freely their guests drank. Frightened and awed all at once, she realized the travelers at her table were no ordinary men, and turning to her husband, the two of them dropped to their knees, begging forgiveness for the humbleness of the meal they'd offered to gods. Zeus, touched by the sincerity of their devotion and disgusted by the cruelty every other household in the village had shown, revealed his true form and told the couple not to be afraid, because their kindness was about to be rewarded. He told them to leave their home right away and climb the nearest hill, without explaining further, just urging them to hurry and not look back. When Baucis and Philemon reached the top of the hill, out of breath from the climb, they turned to look down at their village, only to watch it vanish beneath a rising flood, the water swallowing every home, every street, every villager who turned the gods away that night. Only their own small cottage remained untouched by the flood, and as they watched in astonishment, it began to change before their eyes, its straw roof turning to gleaming gold, its wooden beams to marble columns, until where their humble home had once stood, a magnificent temple now rose against the sky. Zeus turned to the elderly couple and asked what they wanted as their reward. Without hesitation, Baucis and Philemon asked for just two things: to serve as caretakers of the temple for the rest of their days, and that when death finally came for them, neither would have to live even a single day without the other, since they couldn't bear the thought of one dying while the other lived on in grief. Zeus granted their wish, and for many years the couple went on tending the temple with the same quiet devotion they'd shown their guests that fateful evening. When old age finally came for them, as they stood together outside the temple one last time, Baucis noticed leaves starting to sprout from Philemon's fingertips, while he, in turn, watched bark creeping slowly up her arms. Neither one cried out in fear. They simply called out their farewells to each other as the change took hold, their bodies becoming two great trees, standing side by side, an oak and a linden, their branches intertwining above the temple grounds for all the centuries that followed, a lasting symbol that true devotion, however humble, never goes unrewarded by the gods. Far along the wind-swept coast of Thessaly ruled Ceyx, king of Trachis, and son of the morning star Eosphorus, a wise and gentle ruler beloved by his people. His wife Alcyone, daughter of Aeolus, keeper of the winds, loved her husband so completely that their subjects often compared them to Zeus and Hera, though comparisons like that, as most Greeks knew all too well, rarely ended well for the mortals bold enough to invite them. Ceyx, troubled by a run of bad omens plaguing his kingdom, decided he had to sail across the sea to consult the oracle at Apollo's distant temple, hoping to learn what the signs meant and how best to appease the gods. When he told Alcyone his plan, she was overcome with dread, begging him not to go, because she knew better than almost anyone the terrible power of the winds her own father commanded, and she feared what might happen to him out on the open water. But Ceyx, determined to fulfill his duty as king, wouldn't be talked out of it, promising her he'd be back within 2 months, and setting sail despite her tears. Alcyone's fears turned out to be well-founded. Just days into the voyage, a violent storm rose up on the sea, whipped into a fury far beyond anything natural, the waves piling up like mountains around his ship, snapping the mast and shredding the sails. Ceyx and his crew fought desperately against the raging water, but the storm showed no mercy, and one by one the ship was torn apart beneath them. In his final moments, as the sea closed over him, Ceyx's last thought wasn't for himself, but for Alcyone, a prayer that his body might wash ashore so she'd at least know what had happened to him, rather than waiting forever for a return that would never come. Unaware of the tragedy that had befallen her husband, Alcyone kept praying to Hera every day for his safe return, lighting offerings at the goddess's altar and counting down the days until the 2 months of his promised absence had passed. Hera, moved by pity for the devoted queen who didn't yet know she was already a widow, couldn't bear to keep hearing prayers offered for a man already dead, so she sent the messenger goddess Iris down to the cave of Hypnos, god of sleep, with instructions that Alcyone had to be shown the truth through a dream. That night, Hypnos sent his son Morpheus, master of dreams and shape-shifting, down into Alcyone's chamber in the form of Ceyx himself, drenched and pale as if he'd just been pulled from the sea. In the dream, he told her gently about the storm that had claimed his life and begged her not to hold on to false hope any longer, because he was already gone. Alcyone woke from the dream crying out in grief and rushed straight to the shore where she'd last watched his ship disappear over the horizon, refusing to believe what her heart already knew was true. Standing on the rocks, staring out at the empty sea, she caught sight of something floating in the distance, drawing closer with every wave, until she recognized, to her horror, the lifeless body of her husband. Grief-stricken beyond reason, Alcyone threw herself off the rocks into the water below, determined to join him rather than live on alone. But the gods, finally moved by the depth of their devotion to one another, stepped in before the water could take her. As she fell, Alcyone found herself transforming mid-air, her arms turning to wings, her body shrinking and lightening, until she touched down on the waves, not as a drowning queen, but as a seabird, skimming gracefully across the surface. Beside her, the body of Ceyx began to stir and change too, rising from the waves, reborn as a bird in self, and the two of them were reunited at last, transformed into kingfishers, destined to spend the rest of their days together on the very sea that had once torn them apart. It's said that every winter, for 7 days before and 7 days after the shortest day of the year, Alcyone's father Aeolus would still the winds across the sea completely, letting the kingfisher pair nest on the calm waters undisturbed and raise their young in peace. To this day, sailors still call these gentle, windless days the halcyon days, a brief season of calm named in memory of a queen whose love proved strong enough to move even the gods to mercy. As the flames of Troy lit up the night sky, and the screams of the dying echoed through its streets, one man fought his way through the chaos, not for glory and not for revenge, but for the survival of everything his fallen city had ever stood for. His name was Aeneas, son of Aphrodite and the Trojan prince Anchises. And even though the war was already lost, his story was only just getting started. Aeneas had fought bravely all through the 10 long years of the siege, second only to Hector among Troy's defenders. But as the Greeks poured through the city's broken gates that final night, he understood that no sword could save his home now. Racing through the burning streets, he found his elderly father Anchises, too frail to walk, and lifted him onto his own shoulders, took his young son Ascanius by the hand, and called for his wife Creusa to follow close behind as they fled toward the edge of the city. But in the smoke and confusion of the collapsing city, Creusa fell behind and was lost in the chaos. When Aeneas turned back to look for her, he found only her spirit waiting for him among the ruins, and she told him gently that the gods had already decided his path lay elsewhere, across the sea, where he was destined to found a new nation and a new line of kings, and that she couldn't follow him there. Grieving but unable to linger, Aeneas gathered the surviving Trojans who'd escaped the slaughter and led them down to the shore, where they built a small fleet of ships and sailed off into the unknown, uncertain where the gods intended to take them, only certain that Troy itself was gone for good. Their journey turned out to be almost as long and dangerous as the war they'd just survived. They came first to Thrace, where Aeneas discovered the murdered body of a Trojan prince buried beneath a tree that bled when its branches were broken, a grim omen that sent them straight back to sea. From there they sailed to the island of Delos, where the oracle of Apollo spoke to them in riddles, telling them only that they had to seek out the land of their most ancient ancestors, a message so vague it led them first to Crete, thinking that must be the destination, only for plague and famine to strike the moment they tried to settle there.
It was in a dream that Aeneas's household gods finally revealed the truth of the prophecy to him. Their journey wasn't meant to end in Crete, or anywhere in the east at all, but far to the west, in the ancient land of Italy, called Hesperia, the land one of Troy's own founding ancestors had originally come from generations before. So the weary fleet turned west once more, sailing past the terrible whirlpool of Charybdis and the monstrous cliffs of Scylla, the very same waters that had claimed so many of Odysseus's men, before finally reaching the shores of Sicily. It was there that Aeneas's father, Anchises, who'd endured the entire journey despite his age and frailty, finally passed away, leaving his son to carry on alone, burdened now not just with the survival of his people, but with the full weight of his father's unfulfilled hopes. Grief-stricken and exhausted, the fleet set sail again, only to be caught in a violent storm conjured by Juno, queen of the gods, who'd never forgiven the Trojans for the judgment of Paris, and who feared the prophecy that Aeneas's descendants were destined to one day destroy her beloved city of Carthage. Battered and scattered by the storm, Aeneas's ships were driven onto the coast of North Africa, where Dido, the widowed queen of the newly founded city of Carthage, welcomed the shipwrecked Trojans with open arms. Dido herself had fled her homeland after her brother murdered her husband for his wealth, and in Aeneas she recognized a fellow exile, a leader who, like her, had lost everything and been forced to start over in a foreign land. As the two spent months in each other's company, their friendship deepened into a passionate love, and for a while Aeneas seemed content to stay in Carthage forever, setting aside the destiny the gods had laid out for him. But Jupiter, watching from Olympus, wasn't about to let his prophecy be forgotten so easily. He sent Mercury down to remind Aeneas of his duty, that his fate wasn't to rule beside Dido in Carthage, but to found a new nation in Italy, one that would eventually give rise to a line of great kings and an empire without end. Torn between love and duty, Aeneas chose, in the end, to obey the will of the gods, ordering his fleet readied for departure in secret, unable to find the courage to tell Dido himself. When Dido discovered his ships preparing to leave, she begged him to stay, then raged at him, then pleaded with him one last time. But Aeneas, heartbroken as he was, wouldn't be moved from the path fate had set for him. As his ships pulled away from the Carthaginian shore, Dido, consumed by grief and fury, climbed onto a funeral pyre she'd ordered built and took her own life with Aeneas's own sword, cursing his descendants with her dying breath and calling for eternal enmity between her people and his, a curse the Romans would remember centuries later in their long and bloody wars against Carthage. Unaware of the tragedy unfolding behind him, Aeneas continued his voyage, stopping once more in Sicily to hold funeral games in honor of his father, before finally reaching the shores of Italy. There, guided by the Sibyl of Cumae,
a prophetess with the power to speak with the dead, Aeneas descended into the underworld itself to seek out his father's spirit one final time. Anchises, waiting for him among the blessed souls of Elysium, showed his son a vision of the great line of kings and heroes still to come from his bloodline, a line that would one day produce Romulus and Remus, the twin founders of Rome, and beyond them an empire whose glory would stretch across the known world. Filled with new purpose, Aeneas returned to the world above and led his people onward to Latium, where King Latinus, ruler of the local Latin tribes, welcomed the Trojan exiles and, guided by a prophecy of his own, offered Aeneas the hand of his daughter Lavinia in marriage. But Lavinia had already been promised to Turnus, king of the neighboring Rutulians, who saw the Trojans' arrival not as fate fulfilled, but as foreign invaders come to steal his bride and his birthright. War soon broke out between the Trojans and the Rutulians, a conflict every bit as fierce in its own way as the fall of Troy had been, with both sides calling on allies from across Italy to join the fighting. Aeneas, weary of war after everything he'd already survived, fought once more, this time not to save a doomed city, but to secure a future for his people in this new and unfamiliar land. After years of brutal conflict, the war was finally settled in single combat between Aeneas and Turnus, with Aeneas coming out victorious, ending the bloodshed and securing at last a lasting peace between the Trojan settlers and the native peoples of Latium. Aeneas went on to marry Lavinia and found the city of Lavinium in her honor, ruling for several more years before his death, after which, some say, his mother Aphrodite carried him up among the gods, granting him the same immortality once reserved for only the greatest of heroes. His son by Lavinia, Silvius, and his descendants after him would go on ruling the growing kingdom for generations, until, centuries later, twin brothers named Romulus and Remus, said to be descended directly from Aeneas's line, and nursed as infants by a she-wolf after being abandoned by a treacherous uncle, founded a small settlement on 7 hills beside the river Tiber. That small settlement, born from the ashes of a fallen Trojan city and carried across the sea by a single grieving survivor, would in time grow into Rome, an empire that would one day rule over nearly the entire known world, its people forever tracing their proud and ancient lineage not to a native founder, but to a Trojan hero who'd lost everything, and who, guided by fate and the will of the gods, found a way to build something greater than what had been destroyed. Long before his descent into the underworld to reclaim his lost wife, Eurydice, Orpheus was already known throughout Greece as the most gifted musician the world had ever produced, a reputation earned not just through the favor of the gods, but through a childhood spent in the company of the Muses themselves. Orpheus was the son of Oeagrus, a king of Thrace, and Calliope, the eldest of the 9 Muses and patron of epic poetry. From the moment he was born, his mother's sisters, the Muses of music, dance, and song, took a special interest in the boy, gathering around his cradle and filling his infant ears with melodies no mortal child had ever heard. As he grew, his father gave him a lyre, an instrument originally crafted by Hermes and later passed down through Apollo himself, who, recognizing the boy's extraordinary talent, offered to teach him personally. Under Apollo's tutelage, Orpheus mastered the instrument at a speed that startled even the god teaching him, and it wasn't long before his skill outstripped anything Apollo had thought possible for a mortal. When Orpheus played, it said the very rivers of Thrace would pause their flow to listen, that wild beasts would abandon their hunting to gather peacefully at his feet, and that even the great oaks and stones of the mountainside would uproot themselves and creep closer, drawn in by the beauty of his song. Birds went quiet when he played, ashamed their own voices could never compare, and it was whispered that even the raging winds calmed whenever his music drifted across the hills. His fame soon carried far beyond the borders of Thrace, and when Jason began gathering the greatest heroes in Greece to join him aboard the Argo in search of the Golden Fleece, it was Chiron, the wise centaur, who insisted Orpheus be counted among them, arguing that his gift would prove more valuable than any warrior's blade. Plenty of the other Argonauts doubted at first what use a musician could possibly be on such a dangerous voyage, but they'd come to owe their lives to him more than once before the journey was over. When the Argonauts sailed within earshot of the Sirens, whose bewitching songs had lured countless sailors to their deaths on the rocks, it was Orpheus who saved them all, drawing out his lyre and playing a melody so much more beautiful than the sirens' call that his music drowned theirs out entirely, leaving his companions untouched by the temptation that had doomed so many before them. It was Orpheus, too, who calmed the crew during the ship's worst storms, his songs soothing the fears of even the bravest heroes aboard, and who settled disputes among the Argonauts with gentle music whenever tempers threatened to boil over into violence. It was only after he returned from this great voyage, his fame now legendary across the Greek world, that Orpheus met and fell in love with the wood nymph Eurydice, beginning the far more tragic chapter of his story that would later carry him down into the depths of the underworld itself, a tale already well known throughout Greece by the time he was mourned as one of its greatest and most sorrowful heroes. Even in death, torn apart, it's said, by grief-maddened followers of Dionysus who couldn't forgive him for turning away from all other loves after losing Eurydice, his severed head kept on singing as it floated down the river Hebrus and out to sea, its haunting melody carried all the way to the shores of Lesbos, where the people buried it with honor, and where, ever after, the island's poets were said to produce the sweetest songs in all of Greece. Centuries after Aeneas led his Trojan survivors to the shores of Italy, and generations after his descendants, Romulus and Remus, founded their small settlement on the Palatine Hill, the city of Rome began its long transformation from a humble village of shepherds into the greatest power the ancient world would ever know, guided in its earliest days not by senates or emperors, but a line of 7 legendary kings, each one remembered for shaping the young city in his own distinct way.
Romulus, the city's founder, ruled first, having killed his own twin brother Remus in a dispute over which hill their new city should be built on. An act of bloodshed, some said, cursed Rome from the very moment of its founding, and yet also its first and most decisive act of leadership. To populate his fledgling city, which struggled at first to draw settlers, Romulus invited the outcasts, exiles, and runaway slaves of neighboring lands to make their home there, granting sanctuary to any man willing to swear loyalty to Rome, regardless of his past. But with a city built almost entirely of men, Romulus soon faced a crisis of survival, because without wives there could be no children, and without children no future generations to inherit everything he'd built. And so, in one of the most notorious episodes of early Roman legend, Romulus invited the neighboring Sabine people to a great festival in Rome, and during the celebrations signaled his men to seize the unmarried Sabine women and carry them off as wives, an act remembered ever after as the rape of the Sabine women. War between the Romans and the furious Sabines seemed all but certain, until the women themselves, having grown attached to their new husbands and unwilling to watch their fathers and husbands slaughter one another, threw themselves between the opposing armies, begging for peace. Moved by their courage, the two peoples agreed to unite as one nation instead, with Romulus ruling alongside the Sabine king Titus Tatius until his co-ruler's death left him sole king once again.
Romulus reigned for many years before vanishing during a violent storm while reviewing his troops on the field of Mars, his body never found. The Romans came to believe he'd been carried up to the heavens by his father, the war god Mars, and afterward worshipped him as the god Quirinus, protector of the Roman people. After Romulus came Numa Pompilius, a wise and deeply pious Sabian chosen by the Roman Senate for his reputation as a man of peace rather than war. Where Romulus had built Rome through conquest and force, Numa built its soul, establishing the city's earliest religious institutions, founding the priesthoods of the Vestal Virgins who tended Rome's sacred fire, and reforming the calendar itself to bring order to the passing seasons. It's said Numa met secretly each night with the nymph Egeria in a sacred grove outside the city, who guided him in matters of law and religion. And under his 43 years of peaceful rule, Rome grew not through the sword, but through wisdom, its temples and traditions taking root deeply enough to outlast the city's earliest kings by well over 1,000 years. The kings who followed carried Rome further still from its humble beginnings. Tullus Hostilius, a fierce and warlike ruler who conquered the neighboring city of Alba Longa, the very city Romulus and Remus themselves had originally come from. Uncus Marcius, grandson of Numa, who extended Rome's territory to the sea and built the city's first bridge across the Tiber. And Tarquinius Priscus, an ambitious foreigner of Etruscan blood, who brought with him the grand architecture, the games, and the ceremonial trappings that would come to define Roman culture for centuries. Servius Tullius, said to have been born a slave in the royal household before rising to marry into the royal family and eventually seize the throne himself, went on to reorganize Roman society into classes based on wealth, laying the groundwork for the political structures that would one day define the Roman Republic. But it was the seventh and final king, Tarquinius Superbus, the Tarquin the Proud, whose tyranny and cruelty would ultimately bring the end of the Age of Kings. After his son committed a terrible crime against a noblewoman named Lucretia, who took her own life rather than live with the shame, the outraged citizens of Rome rose up, drove the king and his family into exile, and swore never again to be ruled by a single man. In his place, they established a new form of government, one led not by kings, but by elected consuls and a governing senate. a republic that would endure for nearly 500 years and lay the foundation for the empire that followed, an empire whose roots the Romans never forgot, stretched all the way back to a single Trojan hero who'd carried his father from a burning city and sailed west in search of a destiny the gods themselves had promised him. Long after the Titans had been cast down into the endless dark of Tartarus, Gaia, mother of the earth, found herself consumed by a grief she couldn't set aside. Her own children, the Titans who'd once ruled beside her, now lay chained in torment beneath the world. And no matter how many ages passed, she couldn't forgive Zeus and his siblings for the suffering they had inflicted on her firstborn generation. So Gaia turned to another brood of her children, the giants, monstrous beings born from the blood that had fallen on her when Cronus struck down his father Uranus so long ago. Towering and fearsome, with serpents for legs and a hatred for the Olympians bred into them from birth, the giants had waited in silence for generations, growing in strength deep within the earth, until Gaia finally called on them to rise and avenge the Titans. There was, though, one condition attached to the coming war, a prophecy known only to Gaia herself. The giants could never be killed by a god's hand alone. Only if a mortal joined the battle at the god's side could the giants finally be destroyed. Knowing this, Gaia searched desperately for an herb that would make the giants invulnerable even to a mortal's blade, hoping to close off that one weakness before the war even began. But Zeus, learning of the prophecy through his own network of spies among the stars, moved fast. He commanded the sun, the moon, and the dawn to stop shining altogether, plunging the world into total darkness so Gaia couldn't find the herb before the war began. In that darkness, Zeus himself found the plant first and hid it away where nobody could reach it, then sent word to Olympus that the time had finally come to call on a mortal champion, the one detail Gaia had never planned for. The giants rose from the earth as a colossal army, so vast the ground itself trembled under their footsteps, led by their king Porphyrion and the terrible Alcyoneus, a giant so powerful he could never be killed so long as he stood on the soil of his own birth. Behind them marched countless more, each one armed with torn-up mountains and burning oaks, ready to storm the gates of Olympus and cast the gods down, just as the gods had once cast down the Titans. Zeus called his mortal grandson Heracles to his side, the only champion strong enough to stand among the gods in battle, and together the Olympians rode out to meet the giants on the plains of Phlegra, where the earth itself seemed to groan under the weight of the coming war. The battle that followed shook the heavens and the earth alike. Athena, first to strike, hurled the massive island of Sicily onto the giant Enceladus as he tried to flee, burying him under its weight forever. And people say the fires of Mount Etna, rising from beneath the island, are nothing more than his furious, endless breath, still struggling against the crushing stone above him. Poseidon broke off a piece of the island of Kos and cast it down on the giant polybotes, trapping him beneath the waves in a tomb of rock and sea. Dionysus, wielding not weapons but wine and madness, drove several of the giants into such a frenzy that they turned on one another, tearing each other apart before a single Olympian blade had even touched them. Hephaestus hurled molten iron from his forge straight into the eyes of his attackers, blinding them long enough for Heracles to finish the job with his poisoned arrows, each wound a fatal echo of the Hydra's venom he'd claimed years before. It was Alcyoneus who proved the fiercest of them all, because as long as his feet touched the soil of his homeland, no wound could kill him, and time after time he rose from blows that would have finished off any other creature, roaring back into the fight, stronger than before. Heracles, growing desperate, finally understood the trick of it, and with Athena's guidance, dragged the giant beyond the borders of his birthplace before striking the killing blow. Cut off from the earth that had sustained him, Alcyoneus finally fell, never to rise again.
The battle that followed shook the heavens and the earth alike. Athena, first to strike, hurled the massive island of Sicily onto the giant Enceladus as he tried to flee, burying him under its weight forever. And people say the fires of Mount Etna, rising from beneath the island, are nothing more than his furious, endless breath still struggling against the crushing stone above him. Poseidon broke off a piece of the island of Kos and cast it down on the giant Polybotes, trapping him beneath the waves in a tomb of rock and sea. One by one, the giants were cut down across the battlefield, their bodies broken beneath mountains, drowned beneath seas, or pierced through arrows dipped in poison older than the gods themselves. By the time the sun and moon were finally allowed to shine again, the war was over, and the last of Gaia's monstrous children lay dead or buried beneath the very earth that had given them life. Gaia, watching her final attempt at vengeance crumble to ruin, wasn't ready to give up just yet. In her deepest fury, she turned to Tartarus itself, the primordial pit of darkness that had existed since the very beginning of creation, and together the two of them conceived one last and most terrible child, a monster so powerful even the Olympians would tremble before it. Typhon. Typhon was said to be bigger than any mountain, so tall his head brushed the stars themselves, with 100 serpent heads sprouting from his shoulders, each one hissing with fire and venom, and legs made of coiling vipers instead of feet. Flames poured from his eyes, and when he roared, the sound was so terrible it could be mistaken for 1,000 different beasts bellowing at once, the barking of dogs, the roaring of lions, the hissing of serpents, all blended into one impossible voice. When Typhon rose from the earth and marched toward Olympus, even the gods were struck with terror. Many, it said, fled in fear, turning themselves into animals and scattering across Egypt to hide from the monster's wrath, with Apollo becoming a hawk, Hermes an ibis, and even great Ares taking the form of a fish just to escape detection. Only Zeus and Athena stayed behind, unwilling to abandon their thrones without a fight. Zeus met Typhon head-on, hurling thunderbolt after thunderbolt at the approaching monster, but Typhon proved far stronger than any enemy the king of the gods had ever faced. Wrapping his massive serpent coils around Zeus, Typhon overpowered him completely, tearing the sinews from his hands and feet and leaving him helpless, then carrying him off to a cave in Cilicia, hiding the stolen sinews inside a bearskin guarded by a dragon named Delphine, leaving Zeus crippled and unable to fight back. For a while, it looked like the reign of the Olympians was finally over,
But Hermes, the cunning messenger god, along with the shepherd god Pan, weren't ready to accept that fate so easily. Sneaking into the cave under cover of darkness, the two gods managed to steal back Zeus's stolen sinews right under the dragon's watch, restoring them to their rightful place and setting the king of the gods free. Restored to his full strength and burning with fury over the humiliation he'd suffered, Zeus returned to the battle with a vengeance the world had never seen before. Mounting his chariot, he chased Typhon across the earth, hurling thunderbolt after thunderbolt at the fleeing monster, pursuing him from Greece to Sicily and scorching the land wherever the battle passed. Some say leaving behind the very deserts of Syria and the barren volcanic slopes that still burn to this day. At last, cornering Typhon on the island of Sicily, Zeus unleashed his full and terrible power, hurling Mount Etna itself down onto the monster's head, burying him beneath the mountain for all eternity. It's said Typhon's fiery breath kept escaping from beneath the volcano ever after, causing it to erupt with smoke and molten rock whenever the buried monster stirred in his eternal imprisonment below, a warning to anyone who might forget the price of challenging Olympus's throne. With both the giants and Typhon finally defeated, the rule of Zeus and his fellow Olympians was cemented beyond any further challenge, and never again would Gaia attempt so direct an assault on the gods who'd claimed dominion over the world she'd once ruled alone. But the scars of these battles stayed written into the very geography of the ancient world, in smoking mountains, in trembling islands, and in the deep, echoing rumble that still, to this day, rises from the earth whenever the ground begins to shake, a reminder that beneath the calm surface of the world, the fury of Gaia's lost children never entirely faded away. In the city of Athens ruled King Pandion, a wise father to two devoted daughters, Procne and Philomela, whose bond with each other was so close that neither could imagine life apart. But when war broke out against the neighboring kingdom of Thebes, Pandion turned to Tereus, the fierce king of Thrace, for help, and his army secured victory for Athens. In gratitude, Pandion offered his elder daughter Procne's hand in marriage, and the two were wed, with Procne soon traveling far from her homeland to begin a new life in the cold, unfamiliar lands of Thrace. For a time, Procne was happy, giving birth to a son named Itis. But as the years passed, she found herself longing desperately for her sister Philomela, whom she hadn't seen since her wedding day. Begging her husband to let Philomela come visit, Tereus finally agreed to sail to Athens himself and escort her sister back to Thrace. But the moment Tereus laid eyes on Philomela, a terrible, forbidden desire took hold of him. Hiding his true intentions, he convinced King Pandion to let his daughter travel with him, promising to protect her as though she were his own blood. And the trusting king, moved by his daughter's tearful pleas to see her sister once more, let her go. During the long voyage back to Thrace, Tereus could no longer hold back the darkness that had taken root in him. Dragging Philomela into a secluded hut deep in the forest, far from anyone who might hear her cries, he committed a crime against her so vile the gods themselves would later be moved to punish him for it. When Philomela, devastated and enraged, swore she'd tell the whole world what he'd done, Tereus, afraid of being exposed, grabbed her by the hair and, drawing his sword, cut out her tongue, leaving her unable to speak a single word against him. Believing he'd silenced her for good, Tereus locked Philomela away in a remote, heavily guarded tower deep in the forest, then returned to Procne alone and told her that her beloved sister had tragically died on the journey. Procne, grief-stricken, mourned Philomela for months, dressing in black and weeping for the sister she believed she'd never see again. But Philomela, robbed of her voice as she wasn't without resourcefulness. Locked away in her tower with nothing but a loom for company, she began weaving a tapestry, working threads of crimson and gold into a vivid, unmistakable picture that laid out in painstaking detail everything Tereus had done to her. Once it was finished, she managed to convince one of her guards to deliver it to Procne, disguising her true message inside what looked nothing more than a gift between sisters. The moment Procne unrolled the tapestry and understood what it meant, her grief turned instantly into a burning, unstoppable rage. Under the cover of a festival dedicated to Dionysus, when women were free to roam the forests unquestioned in wild processions, Procne slipped away and made her way to the tower where her sister had been held, finally freeing Philomela and bringing her back to the palace in secret. Reunited, the two sisters embraced, but their joy was quickly swallowed up by their desire for revenge against the man who'd betrayed them both. Procne, looking at her young son Itis, the very image of his cruel father, could see no gentler path forward. Together, the sisters took the boy into a private chamber, and in an act of horror equal to the crime committed against Philomela, ended his young life, preparing his body as a meal they then served to Tereus that very evening, with no idea what he was eating. When Tereus, finished with his meal, asked where his son had gone, Procne finally revealed the horrifying truth of what she and her sister had done, while Philomela, still unable to speak, threw the severed head of Itis on the table in front of him. Consumed with grief and rage in equal measure, Tereus grabbed his sword and charged at the two sisters, determined to kill them both in retribution for what they'd done. But before the blade could find its mark, the gods stepped in, taking pity on the suffering that had consumed all three of them, and turned each one into a bird before the chase could end in more bloodshed. Procne became a swallow, forever twittering a broken, mournful song, while Philomela, granted at last a voice she'd been denied in her mortal life, became a nightingale, her haunting melody echoing through forests ever after as a lament for everything that had been lost. Tereus himself was turned into a hoopoe, a bird crowned with a crest resembling a warrior's helmet, forever chasing after the sisters who'd escaped his fury, his cry a harsh, mournful poo, poo, meaning where, an eternal, unanswered search for the family he'd destroyed. High on the slopes of Mount Ida in Troy, long before the great war that would one day consume the city, there lived a young shepherd prince named Ganymede, said to be the most beautiful mortal ever to walk the earth, so radiant in his youth that even the gods couldn't look at him without being struck by his beauty. One day, as Ganymede tended his father's flocks on the mountainside, Zeus, gazing down from Olympus, caught sight of the boy and was instantly overcome with admiration for him. Determined to bring Ganymede up to Olympus, Zeus transformed himself into a mighty eagle, the very bird that had become his sacred symbol, and swept down from the heavens, snatching the startled young prince off the mountainside and carrying him up into the clouds before he could even cry out for help.
Ganymede's father, King Tros, ruler of Troy and the very man the city took its name from, was left devastated by his beloved son's sudden, mysterious disappearance, searching the mountains and valleys for weeks without finding a trace of him. Taking pity on the grieving father, Zeus sent Hermes down to Troy bearing gifts of consolation, a pair of magnificent horses so swift they could run across the surface of the sea without sinking, along with the promise that Ganymede hadn't been lost at all, but instead been granted a great and unimaginable honor, chosen to live forever among the gods. On Olympus, Ganymede was given the position of cupbearer to the gods, tasked with pouring the divine nectar that sustained them immortality during the great feasts held in the golden halls above, a role of tremendous prestige that had previously belonged to Hebe, goddess of youth and daughter of Zeus and Hera. Ganymede's beauty and grace at these feasts became legendary throughout the heavens, bringing joy to gods and goddesses alike, save for one. Hera, already resentful of her husband's countless infidelities with mortal women, found herself just as displeased by his obvious favoritism toward the young Trojan boy, seeing in Ganymede's elevated status yet another reminder of Zeus's wandering affections, extended now even beyond the world of women entirely. Though she could do little to challenge her husband's will directly, her simmering displeasure added yet another thread of tension to an already strained marriage between the king and queen of the gods.
Ganymede, for his part, was granted eternal youth and immortality, a fate that spared him the aging and death that would have otherwise claimed him on the mountains of Troy. In time, Zeus placed his image among the stars, creating the constellation Aquarius, the water-bearer, forever pouring out his eternal cup across the night sky, a permanent tribute to the young shepherd boy who once tended sheep on the slopes of Mount Ida, never imagining his beauty would one day carry him beyond the reach of mortal life entirely into the eternal company of the gods themselves. With the tales of the Gigantomachy, Typhon's rebellion, the tragedy of Philomela and Procne, and the elevation of Ganymede now told, the great tapestry of Greek mythology's lesser-known corners begins to draw toward its natural close. From the primordial chaos that birthed Gaia and Uranus, through the wars of gods and giants, all the way to the quiet sorrows of mortals transformed by grief into birds and flowers and stars, these stories together reveal a mythology built not merely on heroism and glory, but on the full and unflinching range of human experience, love and betrayal, pride and humility, vengeance and forgiveness, mortality and the longing for something beyond it. The Greeks told these tales not simply to entertain, but to make sense of the world around them, of the changing seasons, the distant stars, the trembling earth and the endless sea, weaving explanation and meaning into every mountain, every flower, every constellation overhead. And though the age of gods and heroes has long since passed into legend, the stories themselves endure, carried forward across thousands of years by every storyteller who's chosen, in their own way, to look up at the night sky and wonder at the tales still written there. This concludes the Untold Tales of Greek Mythology series. Thank you for following along through all 7 parts, from Phaethon's fall and Callisto's transformation, through the founding of Rome, to the final battles for Olympus and the quiet tragedies that shaped the stars above.